From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So my name is Amy Stoles. I'm with the National Endowment for the Arts. Ben Percy is a man who prefers a bowl of mummified heads to a vase of pretty flowers. He's a man who's been spotted wearing Wrangler jeans and a pregnancy dress. He's a man who once held a ceremony to try and transform into a werewolf. He hasn't stated publicly whether it worked or not. He's a man who grew up hiking, fishing, firing slingshots, and hammering treehouses in rural Oregon, a man who loves to run and camp in the great outdoors, but works best alone in his basement, sometimes in the wee hours of the night. He's a man who writes powerful scenes about encounters with grizzly bears and other ferocious animals, whose childhood pet was a standard poodle named Coco that humped everything in sight. He's a man who's quick to tell you about all the rejection letters he's gotten from the publishing world over the years, and how some of those very same people are now clamoring after him for attention. He's a man with immense literary talent, a man of great wit who can write honestly about tough subjects, a man whose prose has been described, much like the man himself, as both muscular and compassionate. You see what I'm getting at here? Try and categorize Ben and you're going to get yourself in trouble. Ben's racked up an impressive list of literary accomplishments for someone so young. He's the author of 2 collections of short stories, Refresh, Refresh, and The Language of Elk, and 2 novels, The Wilding and his latest, Red Moon, which came out this year to rave reviews. His fiction and nonfiction have been read on National Public Radio, performed at Symphony Space in New York City, and been published in an impressive list of magazines, including Esquire, where he's a contributing editor. He's won 2 Pushcart Prizes, the Plimpton Prize, the Whiting Writers Award, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. In the same year, his sister won an award, both chosen through an anonymous process. So even the NEA judges were surprised to discover that they'd recommended awards to 2 people from the same family. Red Moon, the novel he's going to read from today, is a fast-paced, multi-layered epic about werewolves, or lichens, taking over society, but it's really about terrorism and xenophobia and human nature. It got a starred review from Library Journal and Booklist and was named one of the best books of the month by Amazon, CNN, Entertainment Weekly, and was selected as part of Barnes & Noble's Discover Great New Writers program. I can tell you it's totally absorbing and clever and creepy in a good way. Go read it if you haven't. You'll love it. And then you'll be glad to hear that he's working on a new novel and he's writing the screenplay for The Wilding, which is great because the American literary landscape continuously needs someone like Ben. But what I also secretly hope for this man with champion sideburns, that someday Disney hears him speak and casts him as the voice of their lead princess in a future animated film. That's when we'll know he really made it. Please welcome Ben Percy.
Thanks so much, Amy, for that intimate introduction. And yeah, I think Disney princess, or I was always thinking Disney villain. That's in my future, I hope. Thanks to all of you, too, for coming out today. So I can remember vividly the first time I met the Wolfman. I was in kindergarten at Crow Elementary in Western Oregon, and I walked into the library and I pulled off the shelf the Universal Studios Book of Monsters. And I pawed through it, and I found the photo of Lon Chaney Jr. with his hoggish nose and his shag carpeting hair and his ridiculous pompadour, and I was completely enchanted, mesmerized and terrified. And later that night, I did not sleep. Called out for my mama. But the next morning, I came back to the school and I pulled the book off the shelf again. Couldn't help myself, I felt magnetized by it. and that magnetism lasted. And in 6th grade, I wrote a research paper, and research papers should definitely have quotation marks around it. It was titled Werewolves, and I say it like that because there was an exclamation mark after it. That's how excited I was about the subject matter. And it had a table of contents that was only 5 pages long. And the final section, the ceremony of the wolf, concerned, as Amy indicated, transformation. And I followed. I always find these strange things in libraries. Universal Studios Book of Monsters, and in this case, it was a modeled leather tome. And I followed the instructions in it and went into my backyard beneath the harvest moon and attempted to transform myself. And it worked. I got a B- on this paper. I still have it. I still have the artifact. B- in blood red ink. Which is one of so many reasons it feels good to stand before you now and say, "In your face, Mrs. Ziegenhagen." So, I didn't start off thinking I would be a writer. I'm not one of those people who in kindergarten crayons their first graphic novel. I was actually interested most in archaeology, and I inherited that interest in a way from my father. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that every single vacation growing up, we went out into the desert and dug stuff up. We'd fill the back of our truck with shovels and pickaxes and whisk brooms, and we'd pull up crystallized deer skulls, fossils, geodes, and our house was like a museum full of these things. So I had really this vision in my head of Indiana Jones, this fantasy as to what my future held. And I had a ridiculous fedora. That's how much I believed in this fantasy. So if you can imagine a little kid with an adult-sized fedora, down to here. And I had a leather satchel full of gems and feathers and bones. And I even had a bullwhip. And I would snap off of fence posts, Coke cans. And I went on several digs. I was actually working for the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry at one point, and I was going through all of these canyons in the wilderness, and I was scouting out rock art locations, GPSing them in, mapping them out. And I was like Sasquatch. I lived in the woods for 3 months. I slept under the stars, and I would go to these checkpoints where there would be like bags of rice and beans waiting for me, and I'd drag them off into the woods again. And I was always doing battle with snakes. There were rattlesnakes everywhere. This is my origin story. So, what I came to discover over several summers of doing this is that I was living a fantasy. Scraping my way through inch after inch of dirt, and the highlight of the day was discovering a bone chip. And I went through a kind of crisis, I guess you could say, an existential crisis, which I think every college student goes through. I realized that what I thought I was passionate about was not as appealing to me as I first believed. And, there was no Lost Ark or the Covenant out there. There were no Nazis to do battle with. There were no rolling boulders. There were certainly no beautiful women. There were just the snakes. So, I was working at Glacier National Park as the gardener, which is kind of a weird thing to be at a national park, but that's what I was. And I was working there one summer. This is during the existential crisis when I was trying to figure out what to do. And I met a woman there, and I was writing her all these lascivious love letters and poems. And she said to me, "You should be a writer." And I said, "Okay." So it's all been an attempt in many ways to impress a pretty girl. But sometimes it just takes that one person to give you a shove, whether it's a friend or a teacher, a family member, a lover. And so, found my path. And I'm bringing this up in part because it connects to this book. And then I walked into my first creative writing class, and I sat down, and I was very excited, very excited. I had grown up on genre. I had grown up on Westerns by Zane Grey, and Larry McMurtry. I had grown up on sci-fi novels, fantasy novels. If it had a dragon on the cover, a dragon and a sword, 2 thumbs up. But horror especially gripped me in its bony fist. I was obsessed with horror. And what happened is I walked into that class thinking that this was storytelling. And on the first day, the professor, who was expressionless, it looked like he looked like a mannequin. Or like he was wearing a porcelain mask. And he read through the syllabus, and one of the things that he said was, no genre. And I threw up my hand and asked him what he meant by that. And he said, no robots, no trolls, no vampires, no robots with lasers for eyes. And I sat there a minute and I put up my hand again. And I said, very earnestly, but what else is there? Because truly, up to that point, that's what I had read. And I was thereafter introduced to all of these writers that I fell in love with. I had never read Tim O'Brien or Alice Munro or Flannery O'Connor. I had never read any of these writers who I now teach in my own classes. And I fell in love with literary writing, but at the same time, I never fell out of love with genre. And I don't know, I had like this, if I could be a literary character of my own, I had my own epiphany. And it happened midway through grad school. And I was reading Michael Chabon's book that he had edited for McSweeney's, and it was called Thrilling Tales. And in this book, he assigned all of these literary writers, like Rick Moody, like Amy Bender, like Jim Shepard and Dan Shawn. He assigned all of these literary writers to write the kind of story that they had read when growing up, that they'd fallen in love with growing up, that made them want to become writers. And I read this book, and I read his introduction particularly. It was essentially an essay that challenged contemporary fiction. And he said that he was a bored reader. He was bored with the work he was doing, and he was bored with what he was seeing in literary journals. And it was an extreme position. But I get where he's coming from. If you, let's talk about the worst of genre fiction. Like, if genre fiction gets a bad rap, it's for this. It's got cardboard characters. It's got pedestrian prose. It's got formulaic plots. But if you look at the best of genre fiction, it's always compulsively readable. It's always caught up in what's most important to most readers, which is story. So that you are, as a reader, it demands that you discover what happens next, so that you turn the pages so swiftly they make a breeze on your face. And what's the worst of literary fiction? The worst of literary fiction consists of somebody drinking tea, staring out a kitchen window at a broiling bank of clouds and having an epiphany. Right? But what's the best of literary fiction? Exquisite sentences, glowing metaphors, subterranean themes, characters who are so alive that they exist in your mind years later. You're wondering what they might be up to. So what if there are no barricades? What if there are no fences? What if this is all a conversation that really comes out of the academization of writing? I kind of feel that these are all phantom barricades. What is Margaret Atwood? What is Cormac McCarthy or Kate Atkinson? Look at Cormac McCarthy. What part of the bookstore do you put that guy in? Is he mystery? Is he thriller? Is he Western? Is he crime? Is he sci-fi? Is he horror? Is he literature? He's everything. He's neither fish nor fowl. And I guess that's one of the things I'm most interested in these days. So I'm going to read first from a very brief section just to give you a taste of the novel. Hooray. So in the opening pages of this book, we're following two characters to the airport. One of them, a man in a charcoal suit. He's sweating heavily. He's a bit jittery around the edges. There's something wrong, obviously. The other character we're following is Patrick Gamble, and he is going from San Francisco to Oregon to live with his mother. His father is headed off to war. And on this flight, something happens. The bathroom door bursts open, and the man with the charcoal suit comes out, and he is among the infected. And everyone on board dies except for Patrick Gamble. So he becomes a kind of conservative poster boy, reluctantly, and is drawn into this group, this sort of vandal group in Oregon, and that's the scene I'm going to read from now. They wear camo jackets and pants tucked into black combat boots. They pull white pillowcases over their heads with eye holes and crooked mouths scissored into them. They shove their hands into black leather gloves. Keep them on. No matter if you get hot, Max says. No fingerprints. And then they pile into 3 cars and caravan to the first name on the list, a Mr. James Duncan at 312 Terrebonne Road. Trick-or-treating took place earlier in the day, before nightfall, so no children crowd the sidewalks, the side roads mostly empty. Pumpkins glow on porches, the candle flames within them sputtering in the breeze and making their triangle eyes and toothy grins tremble with shadows. You're with us, right? Max says to Patrick, and Patrick says, I'm with you. They park blocks away from their target. Their boots drum out an angry song on the sidewalk. The night is cold and their breath blooms gray. On Terrebonne, with baseball bats, they smash out the windows of the car parked in the driveway. On McIntosh and on Ridgeway, they spray paint a pentagram on a garage door, the hood of a car. On 13th Street, they toss an M80 with a spinning fuse into a mailbox and run like hell and turn around in time to see the white-orange carnation of flame, the thunder of the explosion knocking them back a step and making them holler with pleasure. In the Malibu Village trailer court, they navigate the maze of single-wides, the chicken coops, the rusted-out cars up on blocks with mullein flowers spiking through the engine blocks, and find the trailer, a gray vinyl dead whale of a thing. There's a bare branch tree in the front yard decorated with fishing lures and empty cans of Budweiser, and they soak it with lighter fluid and spark a Zippo, and it lights up like a blue torch. At the B&B Auto Detailer, they scale the chain-link fence and move across the asphalt lot lit by high-intensity arc lights. They stare into the security cameras, not worried, hidden by their hoods when they spray paint lichen across the office windows in dribbling black capital letters. All this time, Patrick tries to think about the plane, the lichen exploding from the bathroom, the blood slushing down the aisle, the bodies stacked and splayed all around him, and he admits to feeling good. Hurting back those who hurt him is a good thing. When they roar through a high-end development, most of the windows still dark at this hour, but a few living rooms still swimming with the blue light of televisions. He is the one who hurls a brick through a window and rains the living room with glittering shards of glass. They run. And when they do, he might hear a voice calling angrily behind him. I'm gonna kill you, you sons of bitches, as if this was his fault, as if he wanted this to happen, his life's goal to see his parents split up, his father shipped off to war, a plane full of passengers slaughtered, and when he finally takes the opportunity to lash out and abandon all the vinegary pain stewing inside him, somebody has the gall to threaten him. Part of him wants to rush back with a baseball bat, and the other part of him wants to yell over his shoulder, sorry. He thought things would turn out differently. So that's Patrick, and I recorded the audiobook for this, and it was 8 days in the studio for 8 hours a day. Incredibly intensive experience. There was somebody patched in from New York, a director on an iPad, and then there was the sound studio technician through the window across from me. And every time I mispronounced a word, which I do often, apparently, they would say, stop, stop. 22 hours are on the disc, and I was in there for 50-some hours. So that gives you an idea of how much of that time was me screwing up. And also, my stomach really wanted to be in the audiobook. It seemed like every few minutes they were like, stop, because my stomach would go, you know, or my belt would be shaking or something like this. And by the end of the day, it was so hot there in the studio, too, that I would be stripping off my clothes. I was just there in my boxer shorts, just trying to silence my stomach. But those, you know, on the second day, my throat was not ready for this Olympian event. It had not done nearly enough push-ups to be ready for this. And I started coughing up blood. And if you listen to disc 2, you'll hear it. You know, it's like, which I think really adds to the ambiance of the novel. For those of you who knew me beforehand, though, you know that prior to me doing this audio recording, before I scarred up everything, I used to speak in a whispery falsetto. So, I did a lot of research for this book. I was living in Ames, Iowa at the time, and Ames, Iowa is notable mostly for the USDA labs. So every nasty thing you can imagine is located here. Level 4 security clearance, guys with assault rifles wandering around. And what I love most is that there's a daycare right across the street. Ground zero for the apocalypse. The zombie toddlers are coming out of that daycare. So I'd work out with these guys. I'd be at the gym, and they're not really supposed to talk about what goes on in there. These are the hazmat suit guys. But I'd be, you know, spotting one of them on the bench press, and he'd be on his last wobbling rep, and I'd say, so you're going to talk to me, right? And I ended up filling up 12 yellow legal tablets with information. So I view every story I write as a research project. If I'm writing about a taxidermist, I'm in the studio, clacking the glass eyeballs around in my palm, sniffing the formaldehyde, stroking the polyurethane forms. In this book, there was so much I did not know, primarily about the medical end of things. And what I wanted to do was to create a believable horror. These are not full moon howlers we're talking about here. I talked to the USDA and I talked to researchers at Iowa State University in order to better understand animal-borne pathogens, mutation, vaccination. So prions, or prions, I've heard them pronounced both ways, prions I believe it is though, and this is what is responsible for chronic wasting disease. This is what's responsible for mad cow disease. And it's a misfolded protein, not a virus, that changes the chemical composition of your body, that targets the mind. And if you've read David Quammen's great book, Spillover, which came out about 2 years ago, you know, he talks a lot about prions and how he anticipates that they might be responsible for a great pandemic. And what's great about prions, not great about them, but great for fiction, is that not a lot is known about them. It's a gray, fuzzy area. And so I was able to create a slippery sort of science in this novel in order to give us a post-9/11 reinvention of the werewolf myth. So this is what I do when I'm writing. I used to be a corkboard next to my desk, and every day I would sit down at the desk and I would sort of glance at the corkboard in an organic way, and on the corkboard I have images tacked there, I have conversations that I've overheard at bars and cocktail parties, I have postcards, I have just a cluster of ideas that might serve me eventually. In my new house, which is a new old house, I have instead a dark room. So the previous owner was a hobby photographer, and the closet off of my office was his dark room. And I string the walls with these photographs and these conversations and these ideas, and I go in there every morning with the red light humming and the coffee steaming in my hand, and I commune with my imaginary friends. So it's aptly named The Dark Room. And about a year in advance of writing a novel, I start to brainstorm it. So I rip off this large scroll of paper, a 10-foot scroll of paper from my kids, Melissa and Doug art easel, and I tack it up in the dark room. And along the left-hand column, what I do is I start to build characters. So I'm sometimes sketching them out quite literally. I'm cartooning them. But I'm also giving what I guess you could say are Wikipedia entries on each of them, figuring out what their histories might be, and figuring out what their wants are, their desires. And once I figure out what they want, I am, like a cruel god, putting obstacles in the way of that desire. And that is the first stirrings of plot. So I have these different threads going across this 10-foot scroll for all the different characters. And what I do then is, once I'm figuring out, and this is all in pencil, of course, because so many things are going to change. Once I do this, what I do is over the top of it, I scrawl out what is essentially like a cardiogram or a seismograph, or what I like to call a suspense-o-meter. And so what I'm looking for are the peaks and the valleys. I'm looking for where things spike, where there might be a series of action sequences, and I'm looking for moments of repose. And there's a necessary balance, of course, just as in any song. And it is the balance that is the balance of life. The constant reversals, the moments of pause followed by the moments of drama. So what I'm doing is I start to move things around according to the suspense-o-meter in order to create this larger orchestration of suspense. So I'm going to read you this section right here, which is one of those summits, one of those peak moments. And this character, Claire Forrester, is part of a family that is among the infected. And her parents, though she doesn't know it, were part of a political resistance back in the 60s, equivalent to the Weather Underground. And following that opening terrorist act, there's a government crackdown in response to it, and her parents are among those targeted in this scene. Claire does not know what is happening outside right this minute as the small brigade of vehicles, the armored vans, the black sedans with government plates, appear at the end of her block with their headlights off. She lives in a wooded neighborhood, each house set back on a half-acre lot. There are no streetlights, no sidewalk. The vehicles purr to a stop. Their doors swing open but do not close. Any noise that might bring Claire to the window, the stomp of boots along the asphalt, the clatter of assault rifles and ammunition clips, is muffled by the steady snowfall, a white shroud thrown over the night. She does not know about the tall man in the black suit and black necktie, his skull as hairless as a stone, who stands next to his black Lincoln Town Car. She does not know that he has his hands tucked into his pockets, or that the snow is melting against his scalp and dripping down his face, or that he is smiling slightly. She does not know that her father and mother are sitting at the kitchen table, drinking their way through a bottle of Merlot, not holding, but squeezing each other's hands in reassurance as they watch CNN, the coverage of what the president calls a coordinated terror attack directed at the heart of America. So she does not know that when the front door kicks open, splintering along its hinges, her father is holding the remote in his hand, a long black remote that could be mistaken for a weapon. She does not know that he stands up so suddenly his chair tips over and clatters to the floor, that he screams no and holds out his hand, the hand gripping the remote, and points it at the men as they come rushing through the entryway, the dark rectangle of night, with snow fluttering around them like damp shredded paper. She only knows when she hears the crash, the screams, the rattle of gunfire, that she must run. She hasn't changed often, only a handful of times. Not only because it is forbidden, because she could be jailed for it, but because she doesn't like the way it makes her feel, so grotesquely other. And bruised for days afterward, her body sudden shifting like the growing pains that make children twist under their sheets and cry out at night. She can smell the men now, deodorant and aftershave, cigarettes and gum, gun oil, the sulfur of their weapons' discharge. She can hear their harsh breathing, their voices calling out clear from different corners of the house. She can feel their footsteps pounding up the stairs toward her. Her skin itches horribly as if bubbling over with hives, and then the hair bristles from it in a rush. Her gums recede and her teeth grind together in a mouth not yet big enough for them. Her bones stretch and bend and pop, and she yowls in pain, as if she is giving birth, one body coming out of another. She always cries, tears of blood. This time her tears and mewling come from the pain, and also the dawning realization that everything, in an instant, has changed. But these thoughts are fleeting. The wolf in her has no time for them. Her mind sharpens to a singular focus. Survival is what matters. There is nothing else, no love or sadness or fear or worry, only a needle stab of adrenaline that surges through her, sends her loping toward the window, toward the reflection she barely recognizes, hunched and misshapen and growing larger by the second. Then she crashes through herself, through the window. The glass shatters and shards of it bite at her. There is no roof to scuttle across, no lattice or gutter to climb down. There is instead the blackness of the night, the emptiness of the air she falls through, flipping and twisting as the wind shrieks in her ears and the ground rushes up to meet her. Splinters of glass mixed up with snow sparkle all around her. 2 inches have already fallen, but that isn't enough to cushion a fall from a second-story window. She lands on all fours, rolling and thudding forward, sliding across the short expanse of lawn, smearing away the snow in a ragged teardrop to reveal the green grass beneath. A tree at the edge of the lawn offers a hammer blow to her chest. Her breath is gone. Her wrist blazes. The night seems to close upon her for a moment, and then she draws in a sucking gasp. Her window throws a square of light broken up by triangles and hexagons of yellow and orange that spotlight her body, the spotlight blackened a moment later when the men charge into her room and pursue her exit. She shakes away the pain and leaps to her feet and sees the man, the tall man in the black suit. 20 yards away, he observes her with his head cocked curiously, and then he begins to walk, and then run, his long arms slashing the air toward her. Thanks. So I'm happy to field any questions from the gang. You're supposed to, I believe, approach the mic to shout at me.
As a reader, I want to thank you for a good book, but as an educator, I want to thank you for a great book.
Oh, thanks.
And what I mean by that is, you spoke about your characters and your setting, and maybe you've written a book that will bring somebody like that Universal Monster book to enjoy reading that much. But the thing that you also mentioned subterranean theme. And kind of as a teacher, you get the characters and the plot and the setting, get the kids there, but you really want them to kind of get into the theme and the message because that's what's about life. So could you talk just a little bit about that? What role does theme play? Is it something that emerges later from yours? Is it something that you let people put on? Because there's so much there. And I think the thing that's so good about this book is a lot of times for young people, they don't really maybe want to deal directly with such issues as terrorism, but a werewolf is a great way in. I mean, it's clearly a parable about many things. So if you just talk a little bit about theme and how that worked and what you had in mind.
Great question. Thanks. When I was sitting down to write this book, I was thinking about what made certain fantasy stories resonate with readers or viewers. And oftentimes it seems like these stories channel cultural unease in some way. They take a knife to the nerve of the moment. Sometimes this is a silly sort of thing. If you think about Godzilla as a ridiculous film, but one that has lasted, and it's because Godzilla is channeling post-atomic anxiety. If you look at maybe more canonical examples like Frankenstein, the creature embodies all of the anxiety swirling around the Industrial Revolution and the fear of science and technology, the fear of man playing God. Look at Invasion of the Body Snatchers and how it taps into the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Look at the way that George Romero in his Living Dead movies has reinvented the zombie for every cultural era. Sometimes connecting it to the civil rights movement, sometimes connecting it to the rise of consumerism in the 80s, sometimes connecting it to Cold War anxieties. And look at the slew of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic narratives that have come since 9/11. So I sat down and I was starting to think about what we fear now. And what we fear now is really twofold. We fear infection, and you can look at any store in America and find in the entryway Purell oozing from it. Or every time there's an outbreak of swine flu or bird flu or West Nile, it dominates our headlines. So we're terrified of germs in the US. And we are also obsessed, gripped, paralyzed by terrorism. Stephen King says that terror is the most powerful of emotions. And if you look at the aftermath of the Boston bombing marathon as the most recent example of that, it owned us as a country. So I was trying to braid together these two things, a fear of infection, the fear of terrorism, and make this something that speaks to the right now. And of course, as is the case whenever you're writing something allegorical, the hope is that it's a bit ambiguous as well, that it's not so tidy that you can say, this is representative of this or this is representative of that. I mean, look at Superman even as an example of that. Superman, is he, at the time he was made, does he represent a Depression-era hero? An everyman who rises up and helps out the little guy? Or is he the product of two Jewish immigrants who are trying to show that an alien can be a model citizen, right? So I'm not saying that the werewolf is this or is that. It is just, this book is about the culture of fear that we live in. So that's what I was thinking about when I was thinking about a theme in here. Hey, Corey.
Hi, Ben. This was a really comforting reading for me, so thank you very much. Also, I wanted to ask you about your cinematic influences. I know you just mentioned Godzilla, et cetera, but broadening that spectrum, and so the shape of narratives in cinema and the shape of your narrative, and how you go about taking pieces of narratives and using them to influence your own work, and piecing those together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Thanks so much.
I'm a film junkie. I consume as many films as I do books, and I'm studying them too. I can never relax. I have that problem. I always have, if I'm watching a movie, I have a yellow legal tablet next to me and I'm scribbling down notes. And one of the things that I'm trying to figure out about screenplays, just as I'm trying to figure out these things about books, is how they are put together. And one of the things that's helpful when you're studying film is that everything is very precise, very prescriptive in the way that things happen at certain junctures. And these beats tend to follow the same beats of novels. Novels, of course, allow for interiority. Novels allow for digressive tangents. But the beats are the same. The skeletal remains can be the same. And so if you look at a film, right, it opens up with exposition, and then on page 15 of that screenplay, there's an inciting incident, and then on page 25, there's a first doorway where the character makes an irrevocable decision, and so on and so forth. And so in studying screenplays, it has helped me become, I think, a more compulsively readable writer, in that what I'm talking about is the engine of storytelling. And always thinking about what a character is desiring, and always thinking about how to antagonize that character. And I do the same thing with books, though. When I was trying to figure out how to write short stories, I took a short story writer I really admired at the time, who I thought was great at structure, Flannery O'Connor. And I would read that story 5 times, and then the 6th time, when I was emotionally disengaged from it, I would map out its blueprint. And then I would try to write a story that drew from the same beats, but did not resemble the original story at all. And I did this like 3 or 4 times, and I figured out causality. I figured out structure. Later on, I was having a lot of trouble with novels. I wrote 4 failed novels before publishing one. And one of the things that was hurting me at that time is that I was reading almost exclusively short stories. And I was trying to bring to the page the same intensive language that you have in short stories, and also the same structure, which was a faulty way to build a book, because I would treat a chapter like a short story. I would introduce trouble and resolve trouble within 15 pages. And instead, what I came to understand later, when I had to teach a novel writing class and I had not yet published a novel, I felt very insecure about this, and so I started breaking down novels in the same way that I had broken down short stories before. I would go through the ones I admired with a yellow legal tablet. I love the yellow legal tablets, and I went through and I blueprinted the whole thing after reading it 3 or 4 times, figuring out what the skeleton was. And when I was writing this book, I did the same. I went and picked up Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which was a book everyone was reading at the time, and I wanted to figure out why. I'm still not completely sure. But one of the things that it taught me was how to create something that is long. I mean, this is like 3 old-growth forests and a few spotted owls, pulped up. How to create something that is long but reads like a hail of silver bullets. So I'd look at Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and see that he introduced this clue on page 30 and this clue on page, and then bring it back on page 75 and bring it back on page 125 and then bring it back 250 and finally resolve it on 375. And I refer to these as flaming chainsaws. That this is the way that you write a novel. You have like 7 or 8 flaming chainsaws and you're juggling them. So at the end of most chapters, what happens is the author hurls up a flaming chainsaw, and they don't catch it again for another 30 pages. So you're held in suspense, wondering what is going to happen with this thing. And finally, there it is again. But we still don't resolve it. It's back up in the air, just enough to enchant you and give you that sense of danger before it comes down again. So I am very meticulous. I'm a very careful carpenter. And when I'm looking at fiction, sometimes it's a bit messier, especially novels. It's a bit messier than film. So if I'm just trying to figure out the very base foundation of story, it's oftentimes more evident in film. Any other questions? Thanks for coming out. May you never sleep again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.